You're watching Local Access, Channel 29, exclusive programming for Comcast subscribers.
Hello and welcome. You're watching a program called Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley, and this program is sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. And we're going to talk about the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States of America is the supreme law of the land. The Constitution in 1787, in September of 1787, was signed by 39 of the 55 delegates in Philadelphia. 55 people from around the small country then came to Philadelphia on a long, hot summer and wrote the Constitution of the United States of America. It is debated in the courts every single day. The Bill of Rights are debated in the courts every single day, and the courts of public opinion every day since its inception in 1787. And with us today on the program to discuss the Constitution is a constitutional professor, associate professor of history at the University of North Florida, Dr. Carolyn Williams. Thank you, Doctor, for being here. I really appreciate your time. So what is it about the Constitution? Why did we in 1787 decide it was necessary to write a Constitution, the Constitution that we're working with, because we had declared our independence in 1776 and created a document called the Articles of Confederation?
Why? Why were the Articles not sufficient?
Why were the Articles, why did we have to go from one set of governance to another set of governance? Because when they went to Philadelphia, they went there to amend the Articles of Confederation, right? But they instead decided to put those things aside, trash them, and start again. And this was an emerging country, been around for more than a decade.
Right. Well, it was obvious by 1786 even that the Articles were seriously flawed. In fact, it was that year that a convention was called at Annapolis, Maryland, and they sent out a call for delegates from all the colonies or new states, and only representatives from 5 states showed up. And the people who were most active were Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. And they decided that they really did need to have a serious convention. However, so they sent out the call again, but I really think that if there had not been a rebellion at that point called Shays' Rebellion, probably there would not have been a turnout for this convention that was called in Philadelphia in the spring.
You want to take a moment and say what Shays' Rebellion?
Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion that was led by a man called Daniel Shays in western Massachusetts, and he was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And these men were marching on the courthouses of Massachusetts because they were trying to prevent foreclosures on their properties because they could not pay taxes. And what they wanted to do really was to get new representatives that represented their districts that would create more just and laws for the various outlying districts of Massachusetts. And it was so frightening to the country that men who had basically fought to help bring the nation into creation were now marching on the law officials. And so that really was a red flag that really maybe convinced many people that we better do something, because obviously our central government is not adequate to deal with these very important state issues.
Right, we had different states. I mean, it wasn't an issue for George Washington even during the Revolutionary War, because he had to appropriate money to finance the Revolutionary War, but he had to go to each state individually to get money. And some states at that point would rack up debt and print paper money and not honor it,
Right.
and became really a nightmare in terms of how to actually fund the effectiveness of a working federal government.
Mm-hmm. And so, and one of the issues, well, the financial problem was the most important one, and the one that was most explosive at that point. The fact that probably many of these men who fought with Shays had not received all of their pay from the revolution. And so that was just one of the things that indicated that the state governments could not do it. And I should back up a little bit. The Articles of Confederation basically gave the power to the states.
Right.
And so it was really a coalition of states and a very, very weak federal government with very little, virtually no powers of enforcement. And so that alone was another reason why many people started to question the value and the effectiveness of this central constitution, or the charter of government for the charter for the central government, the Articles of Confederation. So for a number of reasons, and there were other squabbles between the states. There was a real fear that states might make deals and treaties with foreign powers. I mean, there were really a lot of very serious issues that had to be addressed, and it was obvious that the central government could not do that. And so these delegates were charged with going to the convention, or at least meeting in Philadelphia, to see how they could solve the problems by revising. But it was really James Madison, more than anyone else, who convinced the delegates that the Articles could not be fixed, and that they should start all over and create a new charter of government.
And I presume a vote was taken, and that's what they agreed to do, and began rewriting from the beginning.
From the beginning.
From the beginning, not rewriting, but writing from anew.
Starting from scratch, yeah.
The Constitution that we now hold dear and abide by.
Right.
Or we're supposed to abide by. But that's part of what the discussions are today. For example, the executive power, did the executive branch, have they assumed too much power or not too much power? That's an ongoing debate right now today.
And that was a central question. Executive power was the one that was most intimidating to the founding fathers, even Madison. The person who was least apprehensive about executive power was Alexander Hamilton. And the reason that they were all frightened of executive power is because I say they were traumatized by the British monarchy. Americans began with a real distrust of government, particularly central government, because they felt that they would recreate a new monster that would be what they call a republican monster, as opposed to a monarchy that would be just as destructive to liberties. And that is why, even with the executive actually would be on paper equal, of course, to the other two branches of power, but it really wouldn't be until the Jacksonian period that the executive really did exert executive power, or the president exerted executive power. So it took 30, 40 years after the Constitution before even the person who occupied the presidency felt he could really be a strong executive.
And it seems like it's continued on until even today, when we have our president today, who is arguably the most powerful president of all times, in terms of the powers that have been usurped by many people's viewpoint and not constitutionally derived. But let's go back to the origination of this, because they did create what is termed a check and a balance system.
Right.
They didn't just create the executive branch, they created two other branches. Talk a little bit about why they did that. Well,
the first component of government that everyone felt most comfortable with was the Congress. And the reason for that is they felt that the Congress, more than the other two, would be the ones that would be most responsible to the people, and the people would have most power in terms of the Congress. The way it was written, it was only, especially the House of Representatives initially, was the only body that all the people in the states voted for. The Senate was something that was not, there was not direct election of senators until the 20th century.
Right, that was an amendment to the Constitution.
An amendment to the Constitution in the early 20th century. And of course the Supreme Court, the people don't have a direct, you know, they don't directly choose the Supreme Court. It's basically the president who selects,
makes appointments,
the Congress has to approve of it, and that's the sort of checks and balances part of it. And so indirectly the people have have some say in terms of who will be the Supreme Court people. But it started with the Congress, although it was written in such a way that when you read the Constitution, the three major components have equal power. They have equal power, they have separate functions, and they have ways to check the power of the other bodies.
Now, they didn't just sit down one afternoon and come up with this idea. This was hotly debated. There were a lot of issues that the framers could not agree on. And one of the things that in my studies I've learned, that when you hear people talk about the Founding Fathers said this and the Founding Fathers say that, one should be a little bit suspicious of the individual making this claim, because the Founding Fathers did not all agree. There were compromises in creating the Constitution.
And that's what they really were, they excelled at, and they created this notion that government is the result of compromise, because you have a diversity of opinions. And what you want to do in a society like this, where technically everyone has some impact in terms of how the society is shaped, that because there will be disagreement, you have to work with that, negotiate it, and come up with something that perhaps is not what you want, everyone wants exactly, but it does satisfy the needs of what are going to be my desires, my opinions, etc. So it's really the art of compromise that they really work through by creating this Constitution.
And we had opposing factions in a lot of sense, like George Mason and Patrick Henry had one particular view. And then James Madison, Thomas Jefferson had a different viewpoint. You want to talk a little bit about those opposing general concepts?
And even, you know, the Patrick Henry would not attend the convention at all. He said, "I smell a rat."
Right.
And he believed that this was just a slow road to robbing the American people of the liberties that they had won as a result of winning the independence from England. So he wouldn't even go.
Opposed to the convention completely.
Completely.
Right?
So he wouldn't even go there, as they say. George Mason did go there, but he did not sign the document. Jefferson was not there, and that's one of the.
He was in France, right?
And even Jefferson had reservations about the document, because by the end of the process, it had no statement of the rights of the people. There was no Bill of Rights in the original document that was signed by those 39 delegates you mentioned in 1787, in September of 1787. And that would be one of the reasons why many people who oppose the Constitution will say Jefferson actually was on our side, and they claimed him as an anti-federalist. Although Jefferson was not an anti-federalist, but he did share their apprehensions.
And those are the two competing groups that we're trying to talk about, is the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. That's how they're termed.
Yeah, and you have all these shifting alliances. For example, when you go into the Constitution, you have Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who are being the partners in terms of really pushing for the creation of a new document. By the time you get to the convention, it's Madison who really takes the lead and really shapes it more than anyone else by suggesting. Madison had created, by the time he got there, he had a document, a blueprint on which he felt the Constitution
Somebody's got to take that effort, but you have to have a document from which people can work. And that's the hardest part a lot of times. It's easy to say, well, I don't like that. This is not bad, but we need to reword that. That sometimes is the fun part and the slow and arduous part. But you need that original
document. And that's
why he's called, isn't he? What's his nickname?
The father of the Constitution.
But he did not like that term, did he?
He did not like that he did not like that term, because he did not want to think that anyone, that was one person who shaped the Constitution.
And that's accurate, because it wasn't just one person. It was a group effort, a dynamic
and there are
effort.
scholars today who say, well, yes, Madison did play a fundamental role, but let's revisit this idea about Madison, the father of the Constitution. Now, they are in a minority in terms of scholars, but essentially, Madison was played a major role. And once they get to the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton takes a back seat until the presidency is debated, and that's when he spent, I think he spent like the whole day, like I think it was like maybe like 10 hours debating why there should be an executive and why this executive created by this Republican people would not be a monarchy.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I want to ask a little bit more about the compromises that were made, talk a little bit about specifically what they were, and why this Constitution would never have been ratified if it weren't for the promise of the Bill of Rights to come. You're watching a program called Civil Discourse. We're chatting with Dr. Carolyn Williams, a professor of history, constitutional professor over at the University of North Florida. My name is Ken Hurley. Take a look at this. We'll be right back.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.
In these turbulent times, let us not erode the liberties our country was built on.
Let it shine.
Larry Parker, National Honor Society student. Patricia Stevenson, stockbroker. Hector Desario, systems analyst. Driving while black or brown isn't a crime. If it's happened to you, call us at 1-8776-PROFILE and arrest the racism.
Welcome back. We're chatting with Dr. Carolyn Williams from the University of North Florida. My name is Ken Hurley, and you're watching Civil Discourse. We're talking about the Constitution of the United States of America and its origination back in 1787 in the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, and some of the compromises that were made. Doctor, I do want to ask you about those compromises because the Constitution is a document that was made up of competing ideas from individuals who didn't all agree, but yet through their debate, through their patience, through their tenacity, wound up creating this document that we now abide by, or are supposed to abide by. But they had to make some compromises. We talked about the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists. Now, what about this 3/5 compromise?
Well, the 3/5 compromise was part of what was called the Great Compromise, and I mentioned earlier that James Madison had created a document that he thought would be the ideal document for that would replace the Articles of Confederation. And one of the major components of that document was that the federal Congress would have the power to override the states, and they decided, most delegates did not agree with that. They felt that the Congress should not have that much power. The other thing that Madison proposed was that Congress be made up of two bodies, a House of Representatives, what would be called the lower house, that would have certain functions, particularly in terms of taxation, and the Senate, the upper house, which would have other functions, particularly in terms of foreign issues. But in terms of the 3/5 compromise, the question came up was who would be counted in terms of determining how many representatives would make up a state would have for the lower house, because the
who to include in the census.
Who to include in the census. And I should also just point out that the way the Congress does work, that the Senate, they were very concerned about the fact that some states would have more power in Congress than others, simply because they were larger, they were richer, etc. And so they decided that the House of Representatives would be based on the population of the state. And that's when the question came up, who would be counted, especially when you looked at states that had large numbers of slaves. Now, all the states at some point had slaves, but by the time of the Constitution, most of the states north of Delaware had created some provision to eliminate slavery, so that was not an issue for these states. But those states, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, on down, what we call the lower South, they, of course, especially the states like Virginia, which had proportionally had more slaves than any other state in the Union at that point. South Carolina had more African American slaves, mostly slaves, than free whites. And the northern states, who did not have a large slave population and were phasing it out anyway, they felt it was not fair to count these enslaved people because technically enslaved people were not regarded as citizens.
They were property.
They were property.
Right.
They had no power. And the southern states, of course, would not agree to that because that would mean that their power of representation would be greatly diminished as a result of it. And that was something that went back and forth. But in the end, when they realized that without the accepting of at least a proportion of the population of the enslaved people being counted, that the South would not go along with it. And how they come up with the 3/5 compromise is something that actually had been worked out, a formula that had been worked out by the states earlier. And the idea was not only did some people feel that that an enslaved African was 3/5 worth that or the equivalent of a free white person, they also believed that the labor of a slave was only 3/5 as productive as that of a free person, because an enslaved person obviously is not going to work as hard. So you got different kind of explanations about how they came up with the 3/5 compromise. Well, in any case, because it had been used as a formula before for states, then the compromise was worked out that there would be 3/5 of the enslaved populations of states that had large numbers would be counted for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. And that was one of the issues that took the longest to work out the compromise, but eventually it was.
And eventually they did, and it actually wound up in the language of the Constitution, where it actually uses the fraction 3/5.
Yes. But it never, the Constitution never includes the word slave.
That's correct.
It only says all other persons. And so that would be another reason, that would bring up another issue, even at that point, about does the Constitution protect slavery? Because it does not actually say that, you know, it doesn't use the word slavery. It doesn't really say specifically that slavery as an institution is protected, et cetera, et cetera. So it would open up a whole other can of worms, and it showed that the compromise was only a temporary one. It lasted until the Civil War era, but it did last.
Right, and there was a lot of heated debate, as we've been talking about, between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and some of that bubbled up throughout the decades to follow. That's in part led to the Civil War. It was the states' rights issue, the slavery issue, abolishment of slavery issue, and all of that, and then the Great War, the worst war fought on our soil in our history. And that resolved, and then there was amendments to the Constitution that abolished slavery.
Abolished slavery after the Civil War.
Abolished slavery, except if you're in prison, then you can use the involuntary servitude of the individuals that are incarcerated, according to the amendment. But essentially, if you're a private individual, you're not allowed to own a slave. You cannot own a person as your property any longer. And that was one of the compromises. And in a sense, it also talks about as great as this document is, looking back on it, it was discriminatory in many respects, because women were not included at all in any of the debates. Women were also considered property. If they were married to a man. And we've worked very long and hard over the decades, the centuries since the Constitution, to remove that discriminatory aspects of the Constitution through the amendment process.
Well, one of the things that when you talk about women, you have to look at what they consider the rights of citizens. Now, women, free white women and free black women, I want to point out that initially there was for those few African Americans who were free, at that point they would have been regarded as citizens, and they had the rights to vote. Ironically, it's not till the Jacksonian period that you get major disfranchisement of African Americans, and race becomes a criteria for voting. Gender always was, for the most part. And the reason was that the notion was that women would never be independent on the level that males would be. they would always be subject to the rule or power of some male, whether it's the father, the husband, the brother, etc. And therefore, you only want to give the vote to a person who can exercise that right independently. And voting, I should not even use the word right. Voting wasn't considered a privilege, not a right. Voting was not considered a right of citizenship until technically the Jacksonian period. And so the idea, and I should also point out that because of this notion that voting is a privilege, not a right, all men, all white males were not able to vote. There was still a property requirement for voting until the Jacksonian period, and that's why a few African Americans did vote in those states, mainly the northern states that had this, you know, the required property requirement, and a few, and the men who had that power. One state, however, in one state, the state of New Jersey, until about 1807, women actually could vote. Women who were widows and had property, because there had been nothing in that constitution, a new constitution form, that addressed gender. But someone noticed that oversight, and then they changed the Constitution of New Jersey and put gender in it, that it must be a male person with a certain amount of property.
And that's another thing that a lot of folks misunderstand, and it seems a little bit complicated, maybe even convoluted, is the voting aspect of what is described in the Constitution does not describe the individual specifically going to a poll and voting. It describes an electoral college. Speak a little bit to that, if you can.
Well, the founders, the men who created the Constitution, even James Madison, were very, very reluctant to allow the ordinary person to vote, because they believed that person would be motivated more by emotion and other issues as opposed to reason. And also, they felt that the person, especially one who didn't have very much property, would be more concerned about their narrow local self-interest and not be able to see the general picture as the person who was a wealthy person, who was better educated, who had traveled more, who had more resources. That person would be more concerned about protecting their property, etc. Those would be the kind of people that should vote directly, especially for the executive, the person who ultimately would have such enormous power.
Right, and it doesn't specifically speak, there's no real absolute right to vote for the individual anywhere in the Constitution, is there?
Not really.
Not really,
Not really, because as I said, voting was a privilege and not considered a right. It really, the concept of voting as a right of citizenship really is kind of born in the United States with the Jacksonian period and beyond.
And it goes to the states. The states have a lot more criteria on who gets to vote, who does not get to vote.
Yeah.
And in Florida, we disenfranchise more voters in this state than any other state in the country in terms of our former felons and ex-offenders and all the obstacles that those folks have to overcome. That's another program for another time.
Right.
But you have some books here. I want to see what you have here. You've got, this is The Sacred Fire of Liberty, James Madison and the Founding of the Federal Republic. If you want to learn more about it, go pick up this copy, go enroll at UNF and take the course by Dr. Carolyn Williams. Here's Jefferson and Madison, 3 conversations from the founding. I encourage you to go get that book. And here's another good one called Hamilton, Adams, and Jefferson, The Politics of Enlightenment. Another good book to go read. And James Madison, the father of the Constitution. And if you send me a letter to the post office box that you're going to see at the end of this program, send me a letter and request a copy of the Constitution. I will send one to you for free. No questions asked. You'll get a copy of the Constitution. Send me a letter. You'll see the information at the end of the program. Dr. Carolyn Williams, we are out of time. Thank you so much for being here. I hope maybe you'll have time to come back and we can chat more about the Constitution. You've been watching a program called Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley, sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. We'll see you next time. You have been watching a public access television program called Civil Discourse, sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. The ACLU is a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization. Our mission is to protect and advance the civil liberties and civil rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution, especially the principles contained in the Bill of Rights. We want to hear from you. Send us an email, share your views and opinions. If you're interested in appearing on the program, let us know. Friend or foe, we want you on the show. You may contact the ACLU in the following ways. Our telephone number is 904-396-5242. Our post office box is 5331 Jacksonville, Florida 32247. And our email address is aclujax@yahoo.com. My name is Ken Hurley. Thank you for participating in Civil Discourse.
Welcome to The Turning Point, a program featuring literacy and education on Florida's First Coast. I'm Dr. Gail Florence Kane, president of the DePaul School, and here representing the Literacy Council of Jacksonville. I'm very excited about our guest today. We're going to be talking about something that is a new topic for this program, and that's financial literacy.